Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is the very last webinar for this semester that the California State University with the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department is organizing for this installment on bioethics and in general on the problem of how to live a good life, how to achieve well-being. Today, I'm so glad to have here Professor Pigliucci. He is going to talk about Stoicism and what Stoicism can do for our lives. So I will start with a few questions, and please feel free to jump in whenever you want with your questions. So Massimo, one of the first practical questions is, what do we say, how can we say Stoicism? I mean, in the sense that the tradition of Stoicism is quite widespread in time, and each representative of Stoicism was quite peculiar and original. And, you know, having taught Stoicism in this class, it's easy, to categorize. I notice my student tended to categorize Stoicism in this way or the other way. So they don't like emotions. They seem pretty cold.
Right.
So what do we say when we say Stoicism?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question because, first of all, there are a number of misconceptions about Stoicism, and maybe we'll explore a couple. The one about emotions is a clear example. And it's also true, you're right, that different Stoic authors did present a significantly different version of their philosophy. If you look at what Epictetus says is, significantly different from Seneca, which is significantly different from Marcus Aurelius. Although, of course, they have a commonality of, the basic, sharing the basic philosophy. That's not surprising, right? I mean, Stoicism is a philosophy of life, just like other philosophies or religions, Buddhism, Confucianism, etc. And so there are different versions that change through time and depending on the emphasis that individual authors put on things. So Stoicism in that sense is not exceptional. It's just essentially behaves like any other philosophical tradition. What one might want to have is kind of the elevator pitch version of Stoicism, right? Like Stoicism in a few sentences, and it is not that easy actually to do. But my favorite way to present it is this: Stoicism is a Greco-Roman philosophy, the purpose of which is to make us into the best human beings that we can be. It is in many senses analogous. It's the Western analogous to Buddhism. Especially in terms of ethics. There are a lot of similarities between the two philosophies, even though their metaphysics are very different. And Stoicism basically can be summarized as depending on one fundamental assumption and two major ideas. The fundamental assumption is that we should live according to nature, as the Stoics said. Now, living according to nature doesn't mean that you want to strip naked and run into the forest and hug trees, although there's nothing wrong with that if you want to do it. Living according to nature means that in order to live a good life, we need to take seriously human nature, particularly. Not only the nature of the world at large, you want to live in a world that you try to understand, because if you misunderstand the world, you're likely to mislive. But particularly, you have to understand human nature. And for the Stoics, the two fundamental, most distinctive aspects of human nature are, first of all, that we are capable of reason, to a much higher degree than any other animal species. And second, that we are also highly social, again, to a much higher degree than any other animal species, from which they derived this notion that a good human life is one in which you use reason in order to improve social living. Right? So that is the goal of Stoicism, to train you to use reason in order to make life better for everyone, not just yourself. Right? So that's the fundamental idea, the fundamental assumption. The two sort of cardinal ways of doing this are often referred to as the four virtues and the dichotomy of control. The four virtues are, Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics, so it's focused on building character, and virtue just means It comes from the Latin ver, but that itself comes from the Greek arete, which just means excellence. Again, being the best you can be. And the four cardinal virtues on which Stoics focus their attention are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. And the notion is that you should go through life while always checking in with your four virtues, essentially. And practical wisdom is the virtue that tells you what is really good for you and what is really not good for you. Not what other people tell you is good for you or not good for you, but what really is good for you. For the Stoics, that comes down to only one thing, actually. There's only one thing that is good for you, and that is whatever improves your character. And there is only one thing that is bad for you, and that is whatever undermines your character. So you should always do things that improve your character and never do things that undermine your character. Courage is the virtue that tells you that you should do the right thing, even though it may cost you. So we're not talking just about physical courage, the courage to run into battle or anything like that. We're talking about moral courage, the courage to do the right thing. Justice is the virtue that tells you what the right thing is. And justice is understood by the Stoics as treating other people as inherently worthy of respect, with fairness in the way in which you want to be treated yourself. And then finally, temperance is the virtue that tells you that you should do things in the right measure, neither too much nor too little. Right? And we can talk about examples maybe later on. So that's the second fundamental idea: living according to nature, practicing the four virtues. And then the third fundamental idea of Stoicism is the dichotomy of control. The dichotomy of control is often brought up in terms of how Epictetus puts it right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, the manual. And he says some things are up to you and other things are not up to you. And the things that are up to you include your judgments, your decisions to act and not to act, and your endorsed values. Things that are not up to you are pretty much everything else, including all the so-called externals, which include wealth, health, reputation, education, and all that sort of stuff. Now, a lot of people have a hard time with the dichotomy of control because they say, well, wait a minute, but surely there are certain things that are neither under my control, complete control, nor outside of my control completely. There are some things that I can influence, right? And that is true, but the things that you can influence themselves can be divided into two components: the stuff that you control and the stuff you don't control. For instance, let me give you an example. Let's say that I were one of your students and I was preparing for an exam in your course, right? And so the question is, well, what is up to me and what is not up to me? What is up to me is to study the material, right, the best I can, to do the assignments in the best way I can, to pay attention in class when you're talking, taking notes and everything, to compare my notes with those of other people. And then when it comes to the moment of the test, to maintain as much focus on the task at hand as I can. All of those things are entirely up to me. Nobody else can do them for me. Okay. The buck stops with me, essentially. It's not like I can delegate somebody else to pay attention or to study for me. It's on me. The things that are not up to me as one of your students is what the test is going to look like, because you decide that, right? How long is it going to be? How difficult is it going to be? What the nature of the test? It's like that I have no control over. And of course, I also have no control over your standards of grading, right? Those are your standards, not mine. The result of the test is, I'm going to get a particular grade. And of course, that grade is the resultant of these two combinations, these two factors, the ones that are up to me, the ones that are not up to me. So essentially, the dichotomy of control tells you that you should try to, counterintuitively, because it doesn't come natural to people, to shift your emphasis toward internal goals, internalize your goals. We tend to be to emphasize and be focused on the outcome, right? I want to do well on a test, right? That's what I want to do. Well, but that's not up to me. And therefore, I should be focused instead on what really is up to me, which is to prepare well for the test, to be focused during the test, that sort of stuff, right? So the notion is that you should try to internalize your goals and then be okay from the get-go with the notion that in life, sometimes the outcomes go your way and some other times they don't. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes you do well, sometimes you don't do well. And you're mentally prepared for the notion that, okay, well, if the test didn't go well, there'll be another one, and then I can try again. So those are the three fundamental ideas, I think, that underpins all of Stoic philosophy.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I mean, I think we have already a few questions answered in just this first question. I don't know if any of you wants to jump in with another question before I ask mine. Yes, Victor.
I have a question. Since we're talking about, um, I was writing my question when you got to the sort of the good part, but so I'm curious if you can sort of, I'll ask what I'm going to, and maybe you can sort of help me and make it a better question and hopefully answer. But I was curious, and I'm writing a paper for well-being, and I was curious if you had any comments on, well, what are your thoughts on dispositional beliefs and occurrent beliefs? Um, how are those related to cataleptic impressions? So I'm not like the epistemic view, like if I have a cataleptic impression, I know it fully. And how can we how is that related to our impulse? So I'm trying to make an argument that we can mediate our impulses, but we don't necessarily have control over our beliefs all the time. So I'm making an argument that our beliefs happen to us, but we can control impulse. And our the cataleptic impressions, I'm still trying to, of course, understand that concept, but it's my understanding that we have very few of those.
Right. So let's talk first about, that's a good question. Let's talk first about the cataleptic impression. So a cataleptic impression is an impression that you cannot deny, that you cannot convince yourself. Once you have it, you cannot convince yourself that it's actually false. Okay. I guess we should take one further step back and talk about what impressions are. So, right? So, just so to bring everybody up to speed. So, an impression in Stoic psychology is your first usually automatic reaction and judgment about things. So let's say I walk down the street and I see a nice display of a number of gelato flavorings on the in the shop, and my impulse is to go in and buy a gelato, right? So that means that my impression is, oh, gelato. That's a sensorial impression, right? I see the gelato, and then the implied judgment is, good, let me go get it, right? And so my first impulse to action is determined by the impression that I have, right? Now, Epictetus, and the impression, as I said, it's a combination of sensorial data, right? I see the thing, and of implied judgment, kind of automatic judgment. Oh, gelato, of course it's good. Let's go. Now, Epictetus says you should never do that. You should, in fact, stop when these things happen and look at the impression and talk to the impression and say, wait a minute, you may not be the kind of thing that you look like, that you pretend to be, right? So in my case, I would stop before entering the gelato shop and say, wait a minute, hold on. If I go into the gelato, it's like it's two hours before dinner. That's not going to good for me because then it's going to spoil my dinner. On top of which, I indulge in gelato a little too much lately, so my waistline is suffering as a result. So I rather really not go. It's after I think about it, right? I challenge my impression, okay, and now I change my position in terms of impulse. Impulse for the Stoics doesn't mean that you're impulsive and you do things automatically. It just means what you're going to do, right? It's impulse to action.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, of course.
And that would work. This question too. If my impulse takes over me and it's a pathology, then it's impulsive. That's what we say, that your actions are controlling you.
Correct. Exactly. Exactly.
To ask you the question is
exactly.
Moderate.
And you're right that the Stoics agree. And by the way, this is actually supported by modern psychology, by a lot of modern research in psychology. It's not like just because the Stoics said it that we have to believe it. The Stoics had a good intuition about these things, and now today modern psychology actually has a significant amount of research that shows that largely, not entirely, but largely they got it right. So the first impulse is not under your control. The first impression is not under your control. You just have it. You see it. Oh, gelato, go. Right. That's you can't control that. What you can't control is the slowing down, right? You can decide, you can make a decision and say, wait a minute, before I actually walk in, let me think about this thing. And once you thought about that thing, you may still have the desire, The desire for gelato isn't going to go away, right? But you override that desire because now you have a better judgment. Now that you talked to your impression, you have a better judgment. Okay. Now that we know what an impression is, let's talk about the cataleptic ones.
Thank you.
So all of the impressions are, as I just explained, the outcome of an initial reaction and then maybe a judgment that you make if you slow down and talk to the impression. Some of these impressions are undeniable, and those are the cataleptic impressions. Epictetus provides a couple of examples. He says, let's say that right now I'm in Brooklyn. It's about almost noon, and try to convince myself that it's the middle of the night. I can't. Right? There's no way. Yeah. I can reason all I want, but the approach that I used with the gelato worked because, of course, I can challenge that impression. I can say, yeah, no, wait a minute. There are other factors going on here. Maybe I should change my mind about this. But in the case of, is it night out there? No, it's not. I can see the sun. There's no way I can possibly argue with the cataleptic impression, right? So that is what a cataleptic impression is. Ideally, we would like to have as many cataleptic impressions as possible, because those are the really strong ones. Those are the ones that really you can be confident about. However, and here's the trick. Here's the tricky part. The only people that know when they have a cataleptic impression, as opposed to something that looks like a cataleptic impression might not be, are the sages, are the wise people, okay? And the wise people, unfortunately, there's few of them, if any. We are not wise. We're not sages, right? So Seneca says, for instance, that the sage appears a sage appears every time, about the same frequency as the phoenix, the mythological bird that emerges from its ashes, right? And according to Roman mythology, that was once every 500 years. So there are not many sages around, okay, if any. Well, if you're not a sage, you could experience what you think is a cataleptic impression, but in fact, it's not. And there's a wonderful example in Stoic literature of a Stoic actually having what he thought was a cataleptic impression, but it was not. And let me tell you the story. The Stoic in question was Spherus, who was one of the early Stoics. And he was having dinner with a king, and he was talking about impressions and cataleptic and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. So the king has him serve a plate with really nice looking pomegranates, right? And Spherus reaches for a pomegranate and then realizes, once he has it in his hand, that it's actually made of wax. It's not a real fruit, right? It's a copy. It's a really good copy, but it's a copy. And so the king laughs and says, see, here you are. You thought you had a cataleptic impression, but you were mistaken. And Spherus said, well, I never said that I was a sage. I assented not to the impression that this was an actual pomegranate, but only to the impression that it was reasonable to think that it was a pomegranate, right? Because it's a well-done fake, so it was reasonable. That is an interesting example because it shows you that we non-sages could be wrong even about things that we might think are cataleptic. Let me go back to my example of the sun, right? Yeah, it's pretty hard for me to decide to deny right now that it's not, that it's day in Brooklyn. But it is possible that I'm actually suffering an hallucination. It is possible that I'm sick actually, and I'm hallucinating this situation, and it really is in the middle of the night. Or maybe I'm not even in Brooklyn, I'm in Rome or something like that. Is it likely? No. So it is reasonable for me to assent to what I think is a cataleptic impression. But I should always keep in my mind the possibility that I could be wrong even about that kind of stuff.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if that helps, but
no, that helps a lot. Actually, I read I'm reading Tad Brennan's book on Stoic philosophy, so that
yes.
I recognize that example.
Yeah.
So, and sages always confuse me because I'm just like, where is the sage? Is that God? Is that like a prophet? Is that how we can think of a sage? So you've answered a lot more questions than I, which is great.
Well, let me tell you something about the sage, because there actually is some literature. There is a whole book about the Stoic sage there. It's very interesting because it traces the idea as understood by the ancient Stoics, etc. The sage is an ideal human being. He's not a supernatural being. He's not a superhuman thing. He's not a superhero, right? He suffers, for instance, the sage, he or she, because sages can be women, the sage suffers, let's say, a heat or cold or pain just in the same way as everybody else, right? And in fact, the sage is subjected to the same kind of impulses, impulsivity that normal human beings are. Like the sage who probably like a gelato, okay, to use my example. However, the difference between the rest of us and a sage is that the sage always arrives at the correct judgment as much as it is possible for a human being, right? So it's not supernatural, but he has perfect judgment so much as a human being can possibly have perfect judgment. The Stoics and the skeptics actually had debates about this for a long time, because the skeptics argued that human knowledge doesn't exist, that human knowledge is impossible, right? That all we have is opinion. And therefore we should be neutral about everything. We should never say, oh, it's day or it's night. It's like, maybe it's day, maybe it's night. I don't know. It's an opinion. The Stoics, on the other hand, were pretty strong. They said, no, at least the sage can have real knowledge, meaning with a capital K, the kind of knowledge that is really true. And by the end, John Sellers actually, in his book, The Art of Living, actually talks about this debate. There's a chapter there about this debate going on for like a couple of centuries between the Stoics and the skeptics. And he argues that by the end of that time period, the two schools actually converged. The Stoics admitted that, all right, maybe the sage has knowledge, but everybody else pretty much doesn't, right? And so it's like, what we do have, in fact, are opinions, and we need to work with that. That's all we have. But the skeptics, on their part, admitted that, all right, we really do need to differentiate between better and worse opinions, because otherwise we're frozen. We cannot act. If I really truly suspend judgment all the time, right, and I think that everything has the same probability of being right or wrong, then I cannot act. On what basis am I going to act? I'm going to just flip a coin, right? So the skeptics agreed that, okay, well, some opinions are better founded than others. And although we should always remember that they're opinions and therefore they're fallible, and so we could make a mistake. Nevertheless, we have to act, we have to live, we have to make decisions, and we're going to make decisions based on the best opinion possible. That's why Epictetus says that the most important thing you can do with your training as a Stoic is to improve your judgment, right? What he calls prohairesis, that your faculty of judgment, because that is what minimizes your mistakes, right? You're still going to make mistakes because you're a human being, but the better your prohairesis, the fewer your mistakes.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to, thank you. That was a great explanation. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Massimo. Here we are having other questions. There's Ioannis who wrote in the chat and asked, I would like to ask about the concept of the Stoic cosmopolis and its importance for the foundation of Stoic universalistic ethics.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, so the Stoics were cosmopolitan, which literally means citizens of the world, right? Now, the notion of cosmopolitanism, as far as we know, goes back to Socrates. In fact, Epictetus himself, which means that it predates the Stoics. In fact, Epictetus himself in the discourses, in the Enchiridion, at one point says, do like Socrates. When people ask you, where are you from? Don't answer, I'm from Athens or I'm from Corinth. Answer, I am a citizen of the world, right? And that notion was taken over by the Cynics, which was a different philosophical school, which was very keen, very, very similar to Stoicism. The Cynics were kind of Stoics in rags that went around with no property, no family, no children or nothing, and they were just their job basically was simply to remind other people that they were not virtuous, essentially. So you could think of the Cynics as kind of itinerant monks, like modern itinerant Buddhist monks, except much more ragged. Right. The word cynic means dog-like because according to the other people in Athens, the Cynics were living the life of a dog. They were sleeping in the streets. They were, in fact, doing their things in the streets, including sex. They were begging for food, that sort of stuff. The Stoics were nothing like that. The Stoics, Seneca, in fact, makes fun of the Cynics. At some point, he says, I can be virtuous with a good toga. I don't need to be virtuous in rags. It's like there's no point as far as he's concerned. But Epictetus is very he admires the cynics quite a bit. In fact, he tells his students that if you can't be a cynic, at least be a Stoic, meaning that, cynicism is the higher calling, basically. But the point is, cynics also were cosmopolitan, and the Stoics inherited the cosmopolitanism from Socrates. The Stoics actually readily admitted that they inherited quite a bit from Socrates. They initially referred to themselves as Socratics. They were not called Stoics. They were called Zenonians, after Zeno of Citium, which was a horrible name. I'm glad that went out of the way. And then they themselves referred to their philosophy as Socratic. It was only later that they started being calling Stoics because they met initially in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch in Athens, right outside of the Agora. So back to cosmopolitanism. So for the Stoics take cosmopolitanism very seriously. Epictetus has built an entire approach to ethics, which is called role ethics, which is not new with him. It was actually studied by an early Stoic, a middle Stoic named Panicius. But Epictetus really made a big deal out of it. And there is a book by Brian Johnson that is about the role ethics of Epictetus. And it's a great book to understand this concept. But basically, Epictetus says, look, in life, we play three types of roles. Okay? One is the role of a member of the human cosmopolis, a human being. Right? Then there are roles that are assigned to us by fate or by circumstances. So for instance, you are somebody's son or daughter. You don't control that. It's fate gave it to you, right? And then there are roles that you choose given your circumstances. For instance, you are a father or a mother, or you're a friend, or you're a student, or you're whatever else. Those are the roles that you choose for yourself, right? And Epictetus says, here's how you deal with this situation. First and foremost, you're a human being. Your role as a member of the human cosmopolis trumps everything else. You should never, ever, or you should try to never, ever do anything that undermines the human cosmopolis. Once that's set, then you can balance your other roles in the best way you can, and that is up to you. What that best way looks like, it's up to you. And Epictetus, with characteristic sense of humor, says, it's up to you to see at what price you sell your integrity, but for God's sake, don't sell it cheap. Right? So, which is basically a way to say, look, we all have to compromise. Okay, I cannot be a great teacher, great father, great husband, great friend, and all of this other stuff. That's just not possible, okay? There's not enough, it's 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week and all that. That's just not possible. I have to compromise, okay? Where I compromise, so how much of a compromise I make, my integrity basically, that's up to me. He says, Epictetus says, I can't tell you, it's up to you. Just try to raise the bar as much as possible, right? So do your best, essentially. Nobody's perfect, nobody's a sage, but you should strive to do your best. Now, let me go back and conclude about this, the cosmopolitanism stuff. So because our most important role is that of a member of human cosmopolis, right? What does that mean? I mean, how do I undermine the human cosmopolis, or how do I help the human cosmopolis? And there are actually a number of ways. First of all, every time you help anybody else, whether it's your relatives, friends, strangers, and everything, you are already helping the human cosmopolis, right? So trying to be pro-social, in other words, helping other people. That's one way to help the cosmopolis, which means you should always try to do so. You should never shy away from helping other people. But also there are certain behaviors, if you think about it for a second, that are automatically bad for the human cosmopolis. If you engage, for instance, in anything that increases your carbon footprint, you're undermining the human cosmopolis, right? Every time you get on an airplane to go somewhere, you contribute to global warming. That's right there undermining the human cosmopolis. Now, so should I not do it? I mean, I myself travel, well, before COVID, but I myself travel. I go to conferences, I go to etc. Well, so I decided, where do I sell my integrity, right? At what level do I sell my integrity? Well, I decided that I actually have become more picky about my travel, right? I don't accept, for years now, haven't been accepting as many invitations to give, conferences, talks, et cetera, et cetera. I've become more picky, so I reduced the number of my travels. And every time I travel, I pay out of pocket for carbon offsets. Right. So as you know, there are a bunch of sometimes airlines themselves, but otherwise there are a number of organizations that basically you give some money and they calculate. It's all, so how long is your trip? Well, I'm going to Italy. Okay, well that's 4,000 miles. Okay, 4,000 miles is, I don't know, $40 equivalent of carbon footprint. So I just pay the $40. That way, I am in fact increasing the carbon footprint, but I'm trying to balance things out, right? And that's my compromise. That's the way I compromise about things. So there are a number of ways in which you can actually help the human cosmopolis. And that should always be, according to Epictetus and the Stoics, your main goal. You should always try to do what is best for humanity, not what is best for yourself.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Ioannis says his camera off, but I think the answer was, yeah, as usual, it answered plenty of questions at once. We have another question from James. Do you want to ask the questions yourself, James?
Yeah, I will ask.
Great.
So let's see. You spoke about people being able to challenge their impressions, but it seems that, to me at least, some people aren't maybe even aware of the impression to begin with. And I know in the Buddhist tradition, there's the idea of like meditating, becoming aware of all the things that are going on inside your brain that you're not normally aware of. Is there something in the Stoic tradition that's sort of like that to raise awareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, you're right. If a lot of people they're not aware of their impressions. They just take their impressions as at face value, right? Like my example of the gelato. Oh, gelato, go. That's it, done, right? So that's taking your impression at face value. You don't reflect, you don't pause and say, wait a minute, is this really a good thing for me? And yes, the Stoics do have something that often is actually translated as Stoic mindfulness. The Greek word is prosoke. And prosoke literally means attention, just paying attention. And Epictetus in particular has an entire section of the discourses which is entitled On Attention, okay? And it basically says, if you don't pay attention, your life is not going to go well. Seneca uses a metaphor. He talks also about it. He uses the Latin word for it, but he also talks about the same topic. And he says, look, imagine you're a pilot of a ship, right? The only way you can steer the ship is by constantly paying attention. The moment you don't pay attention for even a fraction of a second, the ship goes down. Okay, you're gonna have a problem. You're gonna have nothing has ever improved by not paying attention to things, right? If you're lucky, even though you get distracted, nothing terrible is going to happen. But then you're putting yourself in the hands of luck. And of course, the Stoics say we should never put yourself in the hands of luck, right? Because luck is fickle. Sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't go your way. So you should always paying attention. In a sense, prosoke, paying attention, and particularly paying attention to things that are morally salient, obviously, things like improving your judgment, trying to do the right thing, etc., is a type of mindfulness because you're essentially training yourself to live in what the Stoics call the hic et nunc, Latin for here and now, right? And the reason why you should do that is because the past is gone. It's outside of your control, right? So indulge into thinking about the past, regret. Regret is definitely not a Stoic value. It's useless. It's like you're wasting your time because it's outside of your control. That doesn't mean I would want to qualify this. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn from your past. Of course you should, right? But regretting stuff, I should have done this or that. That's useless. It's done. It's over. No, don't worry about it. The future is not here yet. And it's also outside of your control, right? The only thing that is under your control is what you're going to do right here, right now, which of course is also incidentally the best way to prepare for the future, right? Because if you don't pay attention to what your life is right now, then you're probably not going to have a particularly good future coming up your way. So yes, there is definitely an emphasis on mindfulness, although it's certainly not the same type of mindfulness that the Buddhist tradition has in mind. And in fact, if you guys are interested, I can send Susie later the article, but there is a friend of mine, my co-author for the handbook for New Stoics, Greg Lopez, who is both a Stoic practitioner and a Buddhist practitioner. And he has written an article about differentiating Stoic mindfulness from Buddhist mindfulness. They are kind of different. But the basic idea is, yes, you need to pay attention. And you pay, the Stoics pay attention particularly with judgment, right? So particularly to their own judgment. You have to pay attention and actually arrive at a judgment of, is this thing good for me or is this thing not good for me? Is it something that I want to do or is not? Is this a impression that I can agree with, or is it an impression that I need to deny assent to?
Yeah, and like when you meditate, your frontal lobes become more active, and that's where like the reasoning ability is. So I'm wondering if there's like a technique used in Stoicism that's also like that, or if it's just something that you get better at by practicing it over and over again, or if there's like a set technique that works that.
Yeah, there are a number of techniques that the Stoics use, and in fact, before I go there, I just remembered that one of the sources from which the Stoics get this notion that a lot of people, as you were saying earlier, are just not paying attention, is Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic philosopher that influenced the Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, but he's mentioned also by Seneca. And Heraclitus was from Ephesus, which is in modern Western Turkey. And Heraclitus said that his citizens, his fellow citizens in Ephesus were just sleepwalking through life. They thought that they knew what was going on, but they actually were not paying attention. They were just sleepwalking. And he said, I don't understand why these people don't pay attention to what they're doing. And then they complain about the stuff that happens to them. That's because they're not paying attention. In terms of techniques, there are a number of them. One of them, I think, that I find particularly useful is the so-called philosophical diary or philosophical journal, which is something you're supposed to be doing every night, basically, before going to bed. Both Epictetus and Seneca mentioned this. And in fact, they actually describe how to do it. There is a long passage near the end of On Anger by Seneca, where he actually says, here's how you do it. Epictetus mentions the same technique in the discourses, but it's a little shorter, the description. And basically what it is before going to bed, you take a few minutes, calm down, pick a quiet area, in your apartment or a house, etc. And then start writing down your experiences, about your salient experiences during the day, about things that are about your impressions or your decisions and things like that. And you should always ask yourself three questions, according to Seneca. What did I do wrong? What did I do right? What could I have done better? Right. Now, the first question, what did I do wrong, is not because you don't want to indulge in regret and say, oh, I did something wrong. It's like, no, because that's useless. But you do want to learn from your mistakes. And if you run them down, if you actually run down, by the way, you're supposed to do this while writing in the second person, as if you were writing to a friend, like you did this today. Right. And the reason for that, there is evidence from modern psychology that this notion of second person distancing actually helps, because it tends to put some distance between you and your emotional reactions. Right. You're trying to describe objectively a situation without using any emotional language at all, if possible. And you're trying to describe, you just as if you were writing to a friend. If you're trying to help a friend, you say, today you did this and that was not good. So that sort of stuff. So you want to learn from your mistakes. Second thing is, what did I do right? Well, the reason for that, other than patting yourself on the back, is because at this point you already have established two signposts: what you did wrong, what you did right, and your goal day after day is to move away as much as possible from this and to move as much as possible toward this, right? So you kind of it's a window that you try to move further and further toward the kind of stuff that is actually good. The third question is crucial. What could I have done otherwise, right? Again, this is not a notion, the idea is not to indulge in regret for the reasons I already explained. The notion is, okay, look, although we all think that our lives are very interesting and varied and always stuff happens, all the time, new stuff happens, that's actually not true. If you pay attention, our lives tend to be pretty much the same every day, okay? You get up in the morning, you go to work, you see the same people, you do the same things. You come back home to your family, you see the same people, you do the same things. During the weekend, you go out with friends, you see the same people, you do the same things. Of course, there's variations, and occasionally there is a truly novel thing that you do. But by and large, the same kind of general circumstances and the same kind of people are the ones that populate your life. which means that if you have done something today that you recognize you did not react well, right? Like, for instance, oh, I lost my temper with a coworker today, right? Well, that's going to happen again. Right? That a similar situation is going to happen again. That coworker is going to be there tomorrow and the day after and next month and so on and so forth, right? And a similar situation very likely will occur. Now that you are writing in your diary, in your journal, you're going to say to yourself, okay, well, next time I need to recognize that this is coming. So be mentally prepared. Seneca says the best way to address things, to deal with situations, if you're mentally prepared to them. If you're surprised, you're not going to react well. But if you know what's coming, if you have a good idea what's coming, then you're actually prepared. And not only you're prepared because you know that it's going to happen again, you now have a plan. Say, okay, well, next time that this guy is going to do that, instead of reacting this way, I'm going to try to react that way, right? So all of this basically allows you to, since you know, Seneca says, since you know that in the evening you're going to do this, that helps you paying attention during the day. Because once you start doing the journaling, you are very aware that, oh, tonight I have to explain this to myself. Right? Tonight I'm going to have to write this damn thing. And so you start stopping yourself more often. You pay more attention because, like, hold on. I know this is about to happen, and I know I'll have to explain myself tonight. So let me try not to do it, or let me try to do it differently. It's a fairly effective technique. I think I've been doing it for years. Of course, it's not perfect, and we are not perfect, right? I mean, we slip up. Sometimes you do get, you know it, and then you're still gonna get upset with your coworker, and you're still gonna yell at him. And then after that, you say, okay, sorry, let's start over and try it again, right? So the notion is, again, you're not going to become a sage. You're not going to be perfect. You're just going to be better.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like that's a technique that I'm really looking forward to trying because I already meditate, so it'd be nice to do that. But I'm also wondering, I know you said earlier that your colleague is writing an article or wrote an article about how Stoicism and Buddhism are kind of different, but to me, they still seem really similar. I'm wondering if you think there's any sort of connection, because it's kind of amazing that in two different like spots in the world, they come up with ideas that do have these similarities.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the scholarship there is not clear. We do know of one Greek philosopher, Pyrrhus, the skeptic, who was in India because he followed Alexander the Great into India, and he spent several years in India. And he was there at a moment where Buddhism was very, very young. It was like 150, 200 years old, right? Which, philosophically speaking, is very young. And we know that he learned from Buddhists because he learned the language, and we know that he interacted with Buddhist monks at the time. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to tell how much of the influence goes one way or the other, because we don't really have written documentation of early Buddhist thought. I understand that the very early Buddhist texts, written texts, actually post-date that kind of that episode. They're like 200-300 years later. And so initially, we only have oral traditions on both sides, so it's kind of hard to tell, But there is a book that, if you're interested, that goes into this in some detail. It's called Greek Buddha, and it presents all the scholarship. It's a little controversial. Not every scholar agrees with that particular author, but it's really a fascinating read. However, even though there may have been influences, first of all, Pyrrhus was a skeptic, not a Stoic. But of course, the skeptics themselves influence the Stoics. So it's like, it's all one big family there. My thinking, however, tends to be that a lot of these ideas actually occurred simultaneously in different parts, or more or less simultaneously in different parts of the world, just because they happen to work. Right? They happen to work in answer to the question of how should I live my life. And the reason I think that is because it's not just Buddhism and Stoicism that have a lot of similarities in terms of their ethics. Stoicism also has similarities with Confucianism, which is considered a type of virtue ethics, actually, a non-Western virtue ethics, but it is. And even with Taoism. Like, for instance, when Marcus Aurelius says, the obstacle becomes the way, that if you have an obstacle in front of you, if you think about it, there is a way, instead of butting your head against the obstacle, there may be a way around it. The obstacle itself may give you an idea of how to go and get around it. That's a very similar to the notion of flow in Taoism, where you don't take problems, you don't face the problems with so strong response. You just try to work your way around whatever it is that is happening and redirect things, as opposed to consider them an obstacle. In terms of Confucianism, there are a lot of similarities. The Confucians also recognize 4 virtues, some of which overlap with the Stoics. For the Confucians also, like the Stoics, we're essentially relational animals. Our identity is relational. We are defined by the way in which we relate to our friends, our family, strangers, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of similarities among at least these 4 big philosophies. One could probably push the analogy also to other parts of the world, but that becomes a little more shaky. Like, for instance, Aztec philosophy has some interesting aspects that might be similar to the Stoicism, and there was no contact, right? There was no, there was no way that you can imagine the ancient Greeks going to, Central America at the time. So I think that the one way to think about it, it's certainly possible that there had been cross-cultural pollination, absolutely. But I also think that at least in part, what has happened is that people were thinking about, how do I live my life? And a lot of the same ideas kept popping up. There's a really interesting piece of research recently by a group of psychologists, who actually explored the concept of virtue across cultures. And they found that every single human culture that is capable of literacy, so wherever there is writing, every single one of those cultures has the concept of virtue. And although the specific virtues are different and the emphasis on different virtues is different from one culture to the other, there is a core of 6 that pop up pretty much everywhere. And these 6 are the same as the Stoic Cardinal Virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. And then 2 other things, one of which is referred to as humanity, and the 6th one is referred to as transcendence. The Stoics have something like that. They don't call them virtues, but they are important. Humanity is what we talked about earlier, cosmopolitanism. The notion that we're all members of one big family and that we need to relate to other people somehow in a positive fashion. And transcendence is this notion that we're part of a bigger whole, right? That we're bits and pieces of a large universe. The Stoics have that. They literally think that the logos, the principle of rationality, permeates the universe, and we are literally bits and pieces of the universe in that sense. And Epictetus even says, you should consider yourself, you should think of yourself as a foot that is part of the organism. And right when you had to step into the mud, right? For the foot, that would be a very disgusting thing to do. It's like, oh, why do I want to step into the mud? But if you realize you're connected to a larger organism and that the only way for the organism to get home is to step into a muddy path and you are the foot, then you know that that's what you need to do. And so not only you're going to do it, but you're going to do it gladly because you're helping. That's why the Stoics thought that we should embrace our fate, not just endure it, right? That's what the same notion that Nietzsche later on came up with, and he called it amor fati, love your fate. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good reminder, amor fati. Here, there's another question from Godfrey. I don't know, I don't see you on the screen, so I will read the question on your behalf. He asks, is helping humanity, making mistakes, joy and pain and reflection a lifelong process? How do you practice and live a life of self-improvement without being a slave of it? Is it generating rejuvenation?
That is a great question. And I'm often asked, especially when I give interviews to sort of general press, I was like, oh, well, but what you're saying sounds pretty heavy stuff. It's like, it takes a lot of effort to be a good Stoic. And it's true, but my answer is, so you think that it doesn't take any effort to be a good Buddhist or a good Christian? I mean, it's the same thing, right? If you're a Christian your entire life. You never stop trying to do the right thing. If you're a Buddhist your entire life. You never stop trying to help humanity and decrease suffering and things like that. So the same thing is for Stoicism. Now, that said, of course, you need to give yourself a break. If you think you need a break, by all means. You don't want to undermine your own project, right? And so each Stoic practitioner, just like every Christian or every Buddhist, you do it at whatever your pace, a good pace for you actually is, right? So there are lots of exercises, lots of things that Stoics can practice. I mean, the book that I co-wrote and mentioned earlier with Greg Lopez has 52 of them, and that's not even an exhaustive list, right? So there's plenty of things you can do to exercise, but you don't do 52 all at the same time, right? So you pick one or two that work for you, and then you change things as you go along. But this is really no different from, think about it this way. So I grew up Catholic because I grew up in Rome, literally next door to the Pope, right? So it's kind of impossible to get away from Catholicism. Now, if you're a Catholic, you do exercise. You do your exercises, and the exercises take a number of forms. You go to church, right? That's an exercise because you're communing with other people, your same faith. You listen to the priest, giving your sermon and all that sort of stuff, because you're supposed to reflect on those words, right? You don't just listen passively. You're supposed to reflect on those things. You read scripture, right? You open up a random place in the Gospels and you try to read it and make sense of that passage in terms of your own life, right? You pray, right? And then you try to act as a Christian, meaning following the 10 Commandments, using the life of Jesus as inspiration, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's a religion, but religions are just another kind of philosophy of life. Okay, just because you're religious, so you endorse a certain kind of metaphysics. You think that God created the universe, etc. But that doesn't really matter that much. The ethics is what is important here, and therefore every religion is in fact a philosophy of life, at least in my mind. Now, what's the analogous with Stoics? Well, we read scripture, right? So we open up random passages of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. We read them and then think about what that might mean in terms of our own life, right? We try to live our life according to the 4 cardinal virtues, the dichotomy of control, and so on and so forth. We do get together with other Stoics. There is a number of Stoa in the world right now. If you go and check the Stoic Fellowship online, it actually has a world map with the location of every known Stoa, locally. And if you don't find one in your area, you can start one, register with the Stoic Fellowship, and then when other people come in from the same area, they'll put you in contact. So we do kind of fellowship as well. We listen, of course, to lectures by people like me, for instance, or Don Robertson, or Bill Irvine, or a number of others. That's kind of the equivalent of a sermon, right? Kind of the equivalent of preaching. When I give public lectures, it's essentially the same thing. They're meant to help people reflect on their values, on what they're doing things, and so on and so forth. We don't pray, although there is such a thing as the Hymn to Zeus, which was written by Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoa, in ancient Athens. But most Stoics are not actually into praying stuff. We don't go to temple because Stoicism is not a religion. That doesn't mean, by the way, the Stoics are all atheists. They're not. A number of Stoics are actually Christian. A number of them are Buddhist, as I said before with my friend Greg. A number of them are agnostic, atheist, or just deist. A deist is somebody who believes that, yeah, sure, there is some God thing out there, but it doesn't actually do anything about the world. It doesn't answer prayers. He's out there contemplating himself, contemplating things, and that sort of stuff. So all of that is very much similar to what people do when they belong to a religion. It's really not that different.
Thank you, Massimo. Your passion is contagious. I think I'm going to check out this thing now. Here we have another question from Jorge. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself. I see your video on, or do you want me to ask it on your behalf?
I can ask him myself.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
I guess for me, it's like is there a difference between Aristotle virtue ethics and the Stoic virtues? I know, like they're all like to improve like the ethics or the virtue ethics, or to improve your life and achieve a happy life. I can see, I guess I'm not sure what the difference is between the two virtues or the two beliefs.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there are some differences between Aristotelianism and Stoicism, just like there are between Aristotelianism and Cynicism or Epicureanism. These are all Hellenistic schools, right? They all came up at about the same time. The Hellenistic period goes from the death of Alexander the Great to the Battle of Actium, which marks the beginning of the Roman Empire, basically. So we're talking about the fourth to third century BCE. And then Stoicism, of course, and some of these schools went on for a longer period of time. Yeah, there are some differences. I think one way to understand the difference, other than some of the differences are somewhat trivial, like for instance, Aristotle recognized 12 virtues, not 4, right? So because he was into classification, he was a taxonomist, and so he liked this long list of things. So there were 12 virtues instead of 4. But that's not a fundamental difference. The more important difference is that all of these schools, and I'll give you 4 examples to try to make the difference as clear as I can. All of these schools thought that the goal of life was to become eudaimon. Eudaimon comes from eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the good life, okay? And they differed in the way in which they understood eudaimonia, okay? And so let me start with the obvious ones, the ones that are actually clear to separate from the Stoics, and then I'll get last to the Aristotelians. For instance, for the Epicureans, a eudaimonic life was not a life. We often think of Epicureanism as the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of philosophy, right? But it really wasn't. They were not that much into pleasure. They were actually into avoidance of pain. For Epicurus, the eudaimonic life is a life without pain, not only physical but especially mental pain, okay, distress of any kind. So everything that the Epicureans trying to do is in order to minimize pain. That's their definition of the good life. That's how they cash out eudaimonia. The cynics, which I mentioned earlier, those are the people that live like dogs in the streets. For the cynics, eudaimonia just means virtue and nothing else. No externals, right? I said they have no property, no money, nothing, right? In fact, they thought that other things, the so-called externals like property, money, etc., get in the way of practicing virtue. So they're actually bad for you, right? What a lot of us think is a good thing, like having a house and making some money so that you can pay your bills, that sort of stuff. For them, they were not only neutral, they were just bad because they got in your way of practicing virtue. Right? So those are 2 different meanings of eudaimonia. The Aristotelians thought that eudaimonia means a virtuous life plus certain externals. You have to be virtuous. If you don't, by virtuous, I mean, again, you have to work on your character, right? To become a better person. If you don't work on your character, you're dead in the water. You can have all the externals you want. You can be a billionaire, but if you're a nasty billionaire, your life is not eudaimon, okay? So virtue is necessary, but it's not sufficient, meaning that you have to have a number of other things, at least a little bit of education, at least a little bit of wealth. You need to be in good health, and even you have to have a little bit of good looks. If you don't have those things, you will not flourish, which is why eudaimonia is often translated as flourishing. Okay. Now, the Stoics struck, in my mind at least, but I'm biased, I agree, I will acknowledge, the Stoics struck a brilliant compromise between the Aristotelians on the one hand and the Cynics on the other hand. Think about it this way, right? The Cynics said no externals at all, right? Only virtue. The Aristotelians said virtue plus a certain number of externals. The Stoics said, no, virtue is sufficient in and of itself. Even if you have a otherwise crappy life, it's enough if you're a good person, okay? That's worth living. It's I translate eudaimonia as a Stoic as the life worth living. Your life may still be worth living, even if it's crappy, even if you're sick, even if you're poor, even if you're not educated, even if you're not good looking. After all, Socrates was pretty ugly and he was poor, right? And yet we all think that his life was worth living, right? He's the quintessential, he's the paradigm of somebody whose life is worth living, right? What about externals? The stuff that the cynics think gets in the way and the Aristotelians think it's necessary. For the Stoics, externals are preferred indifferent. Now, the word preferred, the phrase preferred indifferent sounds like an oxymoron, right? Something cannot be preferred and yet indifferent. Like what the hell are you talking about? It's either preferred or it's indifferent. You can't be both. What the Stoics said was, look, other things like, nice apartment or a nice job and so on and so forth are preferred, meaning that other things being equal, you rather have them than not. It's certainly better to be wealthy than poor, better to be educated than ignorant, better to be healthy than sick. However, those things in and of themselves don't make you a better person. You can be a rich asshole, basically, right? And you can be a really nice poor person. You can be in perfect health and being a nasty son of a bitch, and you can be sick and be a really nice person, or vice versa. Just because you're poor, that doesn't mean you're a good person either. They are orthogonal to each other. These are logically independent, right? So you can go after externals as a Stoic. It's okay to prefer wealth, health, education, and all that other stuff, so long as in doing so, you don't compromise your character. Epictetus says that explicitly in the Enchiridion. He says, you want me to acquire money so that I can be helpful to my friends. It's okay with me, so long as I acquire money in an honest way, and so long as I use that money in an honest way, right? So that's the difference. That for the, I think that the Aristotelian perspective is a little bit aristocratic. If you don't, while virtue is definitely necessary for all of these schools, if you don't have some externals for Aristotle, you're screwed. It's too bad. You just have a bad life, period. The Stoics make it possible for everyone to have a good life. Socrates was ugly and poor. One of my favorite examples from modern times is Nelson Mandela. The guy spent 27 years in prison, and he was tortured for some of that time. Nobody would think that that's a flourishing life, right? It's like, no, you're not flourishing in prison. You're not flourishing under torture, right? And yet, Nelson Mandela's life was definitely worth living because he was trying to do the right thing for his people. He succeeded. But even had he not succeeded, right? Doesn't matter. It was still a life worth living, because he was giving an example to others. He was fighting for the right cause. Incidentally, although Nelson Mandela was not a Stoic, that we know of at least, he does say in his biography that one of the turning points when he was in prison happened because one of his fellow inmates smuggled in a copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, and he read it. And he realized that all of this anger, justifiable anger that he had toward the white, Afrikaans, was misguided. He should change things. He should reach out. He should see these people not as evil human beings, but as human beings who were mistaken about what they were doing. They thought that what they were doing was right. And so that the only way forward was to reach out, to become friend even with your jailer, right? And that worked for him. That really was the turning point. He let go of his anger because he read, in part at least, because he read Marcus Aurelius. So I don't know if that helps, but that's pretty much the way I see the difference between Stoicism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, and cynicism.
Very thorough answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
As always.
Yeah, Massimo, I don't have enough words to thank you. I have a question, a follow-up question on that, but I don't want to take space from my students. Peter, I know you have questions for him. Did he already answer your questions, or is anything you want to ask him?
Yeah, Massimo did answer a lot of my questions, actually. I had questions about Stoicism being possibly considered like a self-centered philosophy, but you answered that through talking about the cosmopolitanism in Stoicism. I also had questions about how we can practically live out Stoicism. These ideas, they sound really good, and I agree with a lot of them, but how do we actually transform that into our life? And you answered that by talking about the journal, I don't know, maybe there are others. But there's one in particular that I haven't heard you talk much about. And in fact, we've kind of talked around it, I feel like. It's going back to the fundamental assumption of Stoicism that we should live according to nature. In our human nature is all about human reason and rationality. Where do emotions come into this? It seems like they're just kind of dismissed. They're in the back, like we don't need to worry about them, but they're a big part of our life. So how do the Stoics reconcile with that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because one of the misconceptions about Stoicism is that we kind of try to live like Mr. Spock, right? Stiff upper lip, suppressing your emotions, kind of stuff. And as much as I love Spock, my favorite character on Star Trek, nevertheless, no, Stoics are not like that, or they don't try to be like that. So how do the Stoics think about emotions? As it turns out, again, the general Stoic view is actually supported by modern cognitive science. And I'm not saying this implying that somehow the Stoics figured out everything that science knows today, because that's obviously ridiculous, right? That would be ridiculous. What I think is that they were simply good observers of human behavior, and they had a number of intuitions that modern science, by and large, confirmed. Of course, we have better ideas, we're more sophisticated understanding of human cognition and emotions. But the basic picture is this. Both according to the Stoics and according to modern cognitive science, there are essentially two types of emotions. Sometimes they're referred to as emotions and feelings, but I'm not going to make that distinction right now. Let's just talk about emotions, right? Let's say, for instance, fear. Let's take fear as a type of emotion. At one level, being afraid means that it's an automatic reaction in response to certain situations. Like, for instance, I'm walking at night outside in the streets, and I hear a loud noise that might sound like let's say a shot being fired or something like that. Then I jump, right? I have the rush of adrenaline, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid in the sense that my body, because of evolution, of course, is ready for a fight or flight response, right? That emotion, the Stoics refer to as proto-emotion or pre-emotion, and you have absolutely no control over it, okay? It just happens. There's nothing you can do about it, okay? And in fact, it's a good thing, because it will get you out of trouble in a lot of situations, right? The fight or flight response. However, give a few seconds, and then I'm going to start thinking about why I'm feeling the rush of adrenaline. And I say, oh, wait, that's because I'm sure there is a criminal around the corner, and I'm sure he's after me, and I'm sure this is really a bad situation. Or I can say, oh no, that was just a cat hitting something, and it made a bang, made a noise. So in other words, I'm reasoning about my emotional response, right? And that's what the modern cognitive scientists refer to as the cognitive aspect of the emotion, right? Once you pass the initial response, then you actually start thinking about what it is that you're experiencing, you're feeling. And at that point, your feeling drives the emotion further. If my thinking is negative, is like, oh my gosh, there is something horrible that is happening, then I get more and more afraid, right? I feed on my own initial reaction, and I get more and more into that direction. If, on the other hand, I say, no, wait a minute, that's a perfectly innocuous situation, then I calm myself down, because I have arrived at the judgment that there is actually no danger, right? Now, what the Stoics thought was that once the proto-emotion changes into a full-fledged emotion, it is up to us to talk to our emotions, in a sense, okay? To negotiate our emotional responses. And the reason for that is because they thought that there is no distinction between reason and emotion. It's all one mind. We only have one cognitive ability. This, as I said, is at least in part what modern neurobiology actually has found out. In this sense, the seat of our emotional response is at the base of our brain. It's in the amygdala, right? That's where you get the fight or flight response, the adrenaline rush, all of this stuff comes from there. The frontal lobes are where your mature rational thinking resides, right? The neocortex in the front of your brain, the top of your brain. Now, it turns out that these two areas are massively interconnected, right? And not only that, but they're massively interconnected to your parietal lobes, because the parietal lobes are actually in charge of decision making. Whether you're going to run or not, whether you're going to act in one way or not, depends on how your brain integrates the information coming from your emotional centers and information coming from your rational centers, right? And so, in a sense, if the Stoics were alive today and knew about neurobiology, they would say, exactly, the two are not separate. They are anatomically distinct, but they're so massively integrated that it's a mistake to think about emotions as opposed to reason. Reason and emotion come together. And what is important is how you make them come together. Sometimes your emotional response is correct. You should listen to it. And sometimes your emotional response, your initial emotional response, is incorrect, and you should ignore it. You should not listen to it, right? And in a sense, what the Stoics want to do is not to suppress emotions, first of all, because that's impossible, right? You can't suppress emotions. And second of all, because they don't even believe that emotions are separate from your cognition. So it doesn't make any sense to try to suppress emotions. What you want to do is, in a sense, to shift your emotional spectrum away from what they called unhealthy emotions. The word there is, the Greek word is pathe, which, by the way, is the same root of the word pathology, right? So that tells you they're not good, right? And on the other hand, you want to mindfully, actively cultivate what they call the eupatheiai, the positive emotions, the healthy emotions. So in particular, they say that we should move away from fear, anger, hatred, that sort of stuff. Those are unhealthy emotions. Why are they unhealthy emotions? Because they bring us to act in irrational ways. If you act while you are angry or hating somebody, or you're afraid, you're going to act irrationally. On the other hand, we should cultivate the positive emotion, the healthy emotions, and those include joy, love, and a sense of justice. So particularly consider anger and a sense of justice, right? Often you hear people say, oh, you need to be angry, otherwise you're not going to do the right thing, right? That anger is a positive thing. And Seneca says, why the hell do you need to be angry in order to do the right thing? You should do the right thing because it's the right thing. You should train yourself to experience this positive emotion of, okay, something not right is happening, and therefore I want to do the right thing, right? It's a positive thing. It's like joy. It's like love. It's a sense of justice, that sort of stuff. So that's how they deal with emotions. Now, you may or may not buy that that's the right model. You may or may not buy that that's the right way to go about it. But at the very least, let's move away from this notion that the Stoics try to suppress emotions. That's really not the case.
Thanks. I do appreciate that answer. I just find the idea of we should shift away from these negative emotions is a little bit troubling to me, because in some sense I think we need these negative emotions. They teach us something. They show us that something needs to change, or that we need to do something in our life. And to just say, well, we're just gonna go away from them and push them off and try and never feel them again is, in my idea, kind of the wrong way to go about it.
You're an Aristotelian, my friend.
Okay.
Which is fine, which is perfectly fine. That's what Aristotle says, essentially, that even some of the so-called negative emotions are actually necessary, they're good, etc. The Stoics' response there is like, no, they're not. And the reason they're not is the proto-emotion tells you that there's something wrong, right? The initial feeling of fear, the one that is unavoidable, does tell you something valuable. It does send a signal to you, or to your brain, or to your consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, that, hey, there is something potentially wrong here, right? But the notion that the Stoics have is that if you then feed the initial fear or the initial anger with your own cognition, then you're probably going to make actions that you engage in actions that you're going to regret. There's a really very funny bit actually on anger, where Seneca is directly responding to Aristotle. And Aristotle is saying, you know, a little bit of anger is good for the soldier before going to battle, because they're gonna be fighting better, right? They're gonna give a better effort when they go into battle. So it's okay if they have a little bit of anger, not too much, because you know, otherwise they just mess around with things. But you know, a little bit of anger. And Seneca says, well, by that token, you know, soldiers also go more willingly into battle if they're a little bit drunk. But that doesn't mean you want a drunken army, right? You actually want soldiers to go into battle because of the right reasons, because they want to defend their family, because they want to defend their land, because they're fighting for a right cause, you know, that sort of stuff. But you don't want them to go around a little bit drunk, because otherwise they're not going to act correctly. But your view is perfectly reasonable, and it is essentially the Aristotelian one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. I have one very last question,
Sure.
which is my curiosity. Although we already passed the time we agreed upon, but
it always happens.
Yeah, I don't want to stop it. It's so interesting. You know, I met you during our training for philosophical counseling, right?
Yes.
So what do you do? How much of Stoicism is in your activity of the philosophical counselor? How do you help your clients through what you know from Stoicism?
That's a good question. Stoicism plays a large role, although not an exclusive role, in my counseling. So I usually have a first session with a client. In fact, I'm going to have one this afternoon, as it turns out, in a few hours, for a new client. And the first session, we just explore what the issues, what the general worldview of the person is, right? And then after that, I advise the client to on one of 4 different paths that I lay out. One path is pretty open-ended. I typically do my philosophical counseling as a bibliotherapy largely. So bibliotherapy. So we use books, right? So I assign books basically to read to my clients, and then we work our way through these things. One is open-ended, and therefore basically the book the first book we choose depends on the first session. And I say, okay, well, this based on to what your problems are and based on your background, I don't know, I think that Nietzsche would be good to read, or de Beauvoir would be good to read, or something like that, right? So that's open-ended. However, most of the times, what I do is, like I said, look, I think that you can benefit from a Stoic approach, but a Stoic practical approach, which doesn't mean you have to buy into Stoic philosophy. So we go through I select some of those 52 exercises that we were talking about earlier from the handbook for new Stoics. But I specifically tell my clients, it's like, that doesn't mean you have to be a Stoic. You don't have to buy into Stoic metaphysics. You don't even have to buy into Stoic ethics, for that matter. All you need to do is to actually practice some of these exercises, because they're general. They're actually useful to a lot of people, regardless of their basic philosophical ideas. And the reason that works is because a lot of these exercises are kind of the same exercises that cognitive behavioral therapists use, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most evidence-based modern psychotherapies, started out in the 60s as a direct inspiration from Stoicism, right? The very early people, you know, Albert Ellis and Beck and so on and so forth, those were people who actually read the Stoics, and they thought, hey, these people are actually onto something here. We could use it. We can make it modern. We can, you know, adapt it to modern times. We can do research on and see what actually is effective, what is not. But it actually works, regardless of whether you actually, you know, accept the Stoic philosophy or not. So that's pretty much the way I do it. It's either open-ended, let's see what happens, or tends to go Stoic, but without necessarily implying that the client actually has to buy into Stoicism as a philosophy of life.
And the other 2? You said 4.
The other 2, one is explicitly Stoic. So because a number of my clients actually are already Stoic practitioners. And so they want to actually practice, they want to learn more, and particularly both about the theory and about the practice. The fourth one is kind of a compromise between the first two, and that is, there are some people who I think might benefit from exploring a number of different philosophies of life. And either because they don't have one of them of their own and they're kind of looking for one, for some kind of framework, or because they do have one, but it doesn't work for them. It's at the moment, right? And so in those cases, we explore the basic stuff. We explore some of the ancient Greek philosophies, including Stoicism, but also Aristotelianism and Epicureanism. We also explored Eastern philosophies, especially Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And we also explore some of the modern philosophies, such as existentialism, secular humanism, that sort of stuff. And then the notion there is basically to give the client the tools to either say, hey, this is actually a good idea. This is a good framework. Maybe I should try this for a while, or at the very least to be able to come up with their own mix of things that works for them. It's like, okay, I can take some ideas from Buddhism and mix them with some idea from, I don't know, existentialism, let's say, and that works for me. Great, good for it.
Thank you. Do you think that philosophical counseling can do any good to people?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have, of course, the evidence. There is some empirical evidence about this that's been published. My own evidence, of course, is anecdotal, and therefore, it is what it is. It's based on my experience. But I've had a good number of clients whose life has in fact been changed, according to them, for the better, after doing counseling. Look, counseling, as you know, our friend and colleague Lou Marinoff refers often to philosophical counseling as therapy for the sane, right? So, meaning this, look, if you have an actual psychological or psychiatric problem, like depression, certified depression or bipolarism or something like that, then the first step has to be either a psychiatrist or a psychologist. There's no question about it. Philosophy isn't going to do it for you. But as Lou puts it in his book, Plato, Not Prozac, okay, but once you got the pill to settle down, right? So your bipolarism is under control, or your depression is under control, and so on and so forth. Well, then you still have to make decisions in life. You still have, decisions about your emotional life, your career, your loved ones, your priorities, et cetera, and there the pill isn't going to do anything for you. The psychology isn't going to do anything for you. Then there you really need a philosophical framework. And a philosophical counselor is essentially somebody who knows about a bunch of these different frameworks and can guide you to pick your own. You don't impose a particular worldview on your clients. You simply say, look, these are the options, and would you like to explore one or the other?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Massimo. This
Absolutely.
was incredibly valuable for me. I think for my students also. It's harder to let you go, but you've been talking now for 1 hour and a half non-stop. Really, thank you so much. This was amazing. Grazie di cuore.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks, guys, for coming and for asking questions.
Ciao, buona giornata. Have a good day. Bye.